So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's conversation between independent journalist Kim Kelly and labor and technology reporter Edward Ongweso as they discuss the release of Kelly's publishing debut, Fight Like Hell: The Untold History of American Labor. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country, so if you haven't checked us out yet, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, we are still on hiatus from in-person gatherings due to the global pandemic and continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. On Saturday, June 11th, we're hosting author Yavar Turinsky to talk about his new book, Concepts for a Democratic and Ecological Society. And later in June, we'll start a 5-week facilitated reading group on Cindy Milstein's edited collection, Rebellious Morning. So if you're interested in signing up for these or any other events through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. A note for those attending in the live audience, tonight's speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you are interested in asking anything at any point, really, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the Facebook live stream. Cool. Moving on to tonight's event and speakers. Fight Like Hell tells the definitive history of the American labor movement and offers an in-depth look at the forgotten everyday people, workers, revolutionaries, and freedom fighters who risked everything to fight for basic workplace dignity, like paid overtime, sick leave, disability protections, and an 8-hour workday. It's both an inspiring read and a vital contribution to American history. Its author, Kim Kelly, is a third-generation union member, a member of the Industrial Workers of the World's Freelance Journalists Union, and as well as a member and elected councilperson for the Writers Guild of America East. She's been a regular labor columnist for Teen Vogue since 2018, and her writing on labor, class, politics, and culture has appeared in numerous publications, including The New Republic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and The Nation, among many others. Kelly has also worked as a video correspondent for More Perfect Union, The Real News Network, and Means TV. Edward Ongweso is a reporter at Motherboard by Vice, where he covers labor, crypto, and Silicon Valley. He's also the co-host of This Machine Kills, a podcast that investigates why our technology looks the way that it does. So Kim, Edward, thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight. And I'm gonna pass it over to Kim to talk a little bit about the book.
Thanks, Ash. And thank you so much to everyone who showed up. Apologies in advance for my nasal Fran Drescher-esque demeanor right now. I'm a little under the weather, but I wanted to make sure we could get this event done and talk to you guys, talk to Edward. So we're here. A beautiful thunderstormy day in South Philadelphia where I'm at. And yeah, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the book before we dive in. It's been out for a little over a month now. I still kind of can't believe they let me get away with it. like publishing a book like this that is unapologetically radical as well as diverse and inclusive and chock full of anarchists and communists and socialists and revolutionaries of every stripe on a big publisher is pretty cool. And it means that I'm able to get these histories in front of a whole lot of people that might not otherwise come across them. Because, obviously the subtitle of this book, The Untold History of American Labor, it's not untold in that no one has ever told these stories before, right? Or researched them or preserved them. This book wouldn't exist without the work of, well, the workers themselves who told their stories to contemporary journalists, and then to the archivists and academics and historians who dug up those stories and that information and protected it and preserved it for other folks to come in and learn from them. I see this book as being part of a very long collective effort of preserving working class history. And I'm so glad I've been able to put this out there and to focus on it in the way that, like, from my perspective, yes, my lens, because this book not only talks about, the Lowell girls of, or the mill girls of Lowell, Massachusetts, and, the garment workers in New York City and auto workers in Detroit. It also talks about disabled workers working in the turn of the century sideshow. And it talks about sex workers, and it talks about incarcerated workers and coal miners with black lung and undocumented workers and all kinds of workers whose contributions have been invaluable to the labor movement and to the advancement and preservation of the working class in this country, but haven't necessarily gotten top billing for whatever reason. So my intention with this book was to pull together all these different stories and craft this kind of narrative that just shows that, people have this idea of the avatar of what a union worker looks like, what a working class person looks like. Usually it looks like someone like my dad, burly white guy in a hard hat, probably some bad opinions. But the rest of us have always been here too, since the very beginning. And that's what I wanted to show with this book, that no matter who you are, how you identify, where you're coming from, someone just like you has taken part in some incredibly important struggle throughout history to make the world better for everyone. Labor history belongs to all of us, and so does labor's future. So I could babble on about this thing forever. I spent the past 2 years thinking about it, but I do want to bring Ed in to see what he thinks about all this.
Yeah, no, really excited to talk with you about this book. I think, I was telling you before, one thing that's been really fascinating and interesting to read in the book is how much of some of these stories I haven't really come across it presented in a way for audiences who may not be labor historians or may not be focused on this or that specific industry. And I think also at the same time, a focus also on groups that are not the ones we typically cover in labor reporting at the moment. And so I would love to know, you're both a reporter, you've been a labor organizer. I would love to talk a bit about like the origins of your labor journalism, but also the organizing, and if they come from the same place. Do they both manifest at the same time, or are these things that have emerged for different reasons at different times?
It all kind of coalesced at the same moment, wholly unexpectedly, because, well, this is something I think a lot of folks that follow my work now maybe don't know, but I spent most of my life, my career in the music business, specifically heavy metal world. Like, I'm not covered in tattoos and whatnot just for fun. Like, I've spent most of my life writing about heavy metal and booking festivals and touring with bands and working for labels. Like, that was my whole world. And up until the point, well, actually, yeah, and that was still my world when I first started working at Vice in 2014 and became the heavy metal editor there. And I had never thought about unions really in regards to myself, even though I'm from a union family. Like, my dad, my uncles, my grandma, my grandpa, like, whole family is union, like teachers and steel workers, construction workers. But I never saw myself as someone who would have access to that tradition because I wrote about heavy metal on the internet. That's not, I didn't think they made a union for people like me. But it wasn't until 2015 when a couple coworkers pulled me aside and said, "Hey, we're thinking about unionizing. What do you think?" And I was like, "We can do that? Hell yeah, let's do that." And I got super involved. And that became kind of my unpaid second job. Well, really my job I wanted to go to, because I didn't really want to go to my regular job, because the working conditions of ICE at that time were pretty garbage. Like before the union, it was gnarly. It was not a very good place to work. And the union changed that, right? Because that's what unions do. But while all that was happening, while I was involved in all those meetings and bargaining sessions and late night phone calls and late night, drinks at the beer hall, arguing about what we wanted to do, I was also freelancing at the same time, right? Because even when I had my full-time job there, I was freelancing just because I wasn't getting paid very much. I needed to supplement my income. And I also just had other interests, right? Like in writing about heavy metal since I was 15, I found myself wanting to branch out a little bit as I got to know more of my coworkers at Vice and kind of saw what was possible. And so as I was super involved with the union, and I started to thinking like, oh, maybe I could write about this stuff. I'm a history nerd. I had gotten into politics and found my own political compass just through reading history books and reading about the Russian Revolution and New York in the early 1900s, and just kind of coming across these figures that jumped out to me, whether it was Emma Goldman, Big Bill Haywood, Lucy Parsons, like learning about those people and seeing the intersections their lives had with labor kind of put a little bee in my bonnet, a little bug in my ear. And so really a lot of it comes down to the moment when I started writing for Teen Vogue, again, just because I needed to make some money and they seemed to be receptive. And I pitched them a profile of Mother Jones, because I thought, oh, okay, like this badass historical figure, like their readership is younger, they probably haven't heard about her, that might work. And my editor said, yeah, that's a cool idea, but I'm not sure our readers know what a union is. This was like 2017, before, Guillotine Vogue had taken over as the voice of the vanguard. So it's kind of early in their transition to be a social justice focused publication. So they're like, yeah, why don't you just write an explainer what a union is? I'm like, okay, bet. And I wrote that. And it kind of popped off a little bit because people were not expecting that from Teen Vogue at the time. And people enjoyed it, people shared it. And as a freelancer, I was like, oh, how can I make this work to my advantage? And basically got them to let me start doing a regular column. And as I built up clips there, I got the confidence to pitch other places like the Baffler, the New Republic. Like it's Teen Vogue kind of gave me that first shot and gave me that confidence to think, oh, maybe I can do this. Maybe I do have enough credibility, enough knowledge to actually try to cover these stories in the way that I want to see them covered. And, by the time I got laid off in 2019, I had become less of a heavy metal reporter that was interested in labor and more of a labor reporter that was still writing about heavy metal for a day job. And when I got laid off, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to try this. I'm just going to try and be freelance and be a labor reporter, be a real labor reporter, and see what happens. And that was a couple of years ago. And well, here we are. So I guess so far, so good.
Right. So that, from that moment where you had done the organizing with the union, to where you had been freelancing, writing more about labor history. I mean, what got you to land on the idea of writing a historical book about the labor movement that was focused on stories that aren't usually covered, but still weaving them into struggles that are going on today?
Yeah, that's what I kind of found myself doing as soon as I started writing labor stuff for Teen Vogue. That's what I found myself doing, because I was am so interested in that history and learning more about how we got here and what people were up to 20 years, 200 years ago, that I always wanted. And whenever I'd read history books, I would just see, this little dots connecting in my head, right? Like reading about garment workers in New York City in 1909. Well, a lot of the same stuff is happening with garment workers in LA right now. Like history rhymes in so many different ways, and pulling out those little connections and kind of piecing it all together and showing that, nothing happening right now is really that new. There's always a precedent, and thinking, okay, well, see how people dealt with it then. Maybe we can learn from their sacrifice and their struggle and try and, get a little closer to winning this time. And just as a big old history nerd in general, like I like bringing historical stuff in front of more people, because I think, well, and I can only speak to my own education, but history was not presented as anything that was exciting or fun or really that relevant when I was growing up. I'm from like a rural, isolated place, so we didn't really have, the most up-to-date textbooks anyway, but you can only learn about one side of the Civil War enough times They're not going to really go digging too much deeper. But all that to say, like that's the kind of stuff that I like reading. And so when I got an opportunity to write it, it was like, okay, cool, I'll just keep doing that. And when I got the opportunity to write a book, which kind of came up, kind of snuck up on me too, because I first thought, so I've had my agent for a few years, my first thought was, oh, I'm going to write a heavy metal book. And then that changed a little bit. I was like, oh, I'm going to write something about like anarchism, anti-fascism. And then that changed a little bit. And I was like, okay, I'm writing all this labor stuff. Maybe I can just take this approach I've used in my Teen Vogue columns of marrying the old and the new to show folks, just to bring people into that history, into that present, and make a whole book out of it. Like that was really the whole impetus, right? I was like, okay, this seems to be working and people are responding to it and people seem to appreciate it. What if I actually had the time and the space to dig deeper into these subjects than a 1,400 word online post allows, and like spend some time doing interviews, research, and not have to worry so much about Condé Nast fact checkers. I get my own fact checker, like it was like a fun challenge. Like it was really fun, even if it was frustrating and hard, because like this is the kind of labor book that I wish I had come across when I first started getting interested in unions and interested in organizing. And hopefully I can, this big old brick that I've made will be that for somebody who's just now starting their organizing journey.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really nice way to put it. I mean, I think that a lot of people, and similar to a lot of the stories that you focus on in the book, a lot of people are in a position where they're fed up, and they may or may not know what to do about it or have the capacity to do something about it. And usually through struggling together, or usually through inordinate amount of pressure in the workplace, or horrible conditions, or a disaster or tragedy happening, realizing that they can push back and they've had enough. And so, I think one thing I'd be curious about is, you were talking about how you wish this is a sort of book that you had when you were first learning about labor. I mean, what are some of the ideas here that you tried to crystallize as a result of wanting to write this sort of book that you hoped you could have read when you were first getting into these things or learning about these things as well?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that I focused almost exclusively on women and non-binary people, because I think, and when I talk about labor books, I'm not necessarily talking about academic books and monographs, because those are kind of a different animal, and that's not really the world I operate in. So I'm not making any generalizations about those kind of books. But when it comes to the kind of books that you just might find in your local library or Barnes and Noble on the shelves, they tend to be very, what's the Andy Stern quote? Male, pale, and stale. There's a lot of focus placed on, like historical white men doing things, and like, cool, some of them did great stuff, but what about literally everybody else? And I've always been interested in like women's history and feminist history, just as one of those. And I wanted to really center women's voices and queer and trans voices, because there's so many incredible labor leaders and just worker organizers throughout history that have not been straight cishet dudes, white dudes, but have kind of put into like a secondary role, or left in the footnotes, or just kind of not given the same lionization that, it's problematic to, to create heroes and all that. But I don't know, I feel like the fact that so many more people know about Cesar Chavez than they do about Maria Moreno or Emma Tenayuka just doesn't feel fair to me. And there are a lot of books on great men like that, but there isn't as much out there easily accessible about the women who really move this book forward. And the same goes for like Black and brown and indigenous workers and Asian and Pacific Islander workers, like folks who have been not only like disenfranchised by US society and government at large, but by the labor movement itself. I think it was important to call out moments like, when organized labor was supporting the Chinese Exclusion Act, or coming out against the Bracero program and trying to prevent Mexican guest workers from coming over in the wake of World War II, or even just further back when Black workers were barred from joining unions and when women were barred from joining unions. Like there's always been this kind of exclusionary undercurrent in so much of the established organized labor movement. And I feel like that still exists today. It's not as bad as it once was, but there's a lot of work to do, And I wanted to make it clear too, that even if folks have not even been welcomed into the actual movement that like should have been built for them in the first place. Like they organized anyway, whether it was like A. Philip Randolph organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and organizing Black men and creating that middle class job at a time when that was something that seemed inconceivable, or Dorothy Lee Bolden organizing Black women domestic workers in Atlanta in the 60s, fully outside of any traditional labor union structure, but just getting it done because she and her coworkers they knew they needed to organize and they knew they needed to change. Like just stories like that felt really inspiring and important to me. And I feel like, well, if there's inspiring and important to me, like some white girl in South Philly, I'm sure there's other folks who would read that and feel like, oh, okay, so this history belongs to me too. Whether it's like talking about queer and trans truck drivers or sex workers in Portland, or incarcerated workers leading strikes at Attica a year before the rebellion. Like there's so many different ways to be a worker and so many different ways to be a part of the working class in this country and so many different ways to organize and to fight. And I just wanted to make it really, really clear that, you know, there is a whole world out there outside of, you know, Walter Reuther. And like shout out, he was one of the good ones, right? But there are a lot of bad ones too. And I just wanted to make it clear that, you know, labor history and labor has always belonged to the rest of us too, if not more than the guys who had a little bit easier.
You know, and you know, with the, I guess the resurgence, or it seems the resurgence of workers organizing, of workers trying to unionize their workplaces or struggle for, you know, better rights. Are you encouraged by what you're seeing, not just in terms of the fact that they're organizing, but seeing the sort of inclusion that goes against this history of excluding marginalized workers who have often been at the center of these struggles? I mean, do you think that is like an exciting or hopeful front right now?
Yeah, I mean, probably the most well-known and popular labor leader in the country right now, Chris Smalls, is like a young Black man with neck tattoos and like killer style. And that is who has done, alongside his coworkers and his members of the committee, has done something incredible. Like, yeah, he's cool, but he has done something that no one else has been able to do yet. And that is incredibly inspiring. Like, I think even as he said a few days after they had notched that win in Staten Island, yeah, we've heard from people like 100 different warehouses. Like seeing someone who looks like you win against a giant, I don't think you can quantify how important that is. Or the fact that so many of the Starbucks workers that are leading that charge and taking down Howard Schultz store by store are young queer and trans workers. Like that matters. That's important. I was just moderating a panel today with a group of young workers in their like 20s, which made me feel like an ancient crone, but I love them. They were talking about how younger people, how and why younger people are kind of pushing this movement forward, because they are generally like a more diverse, more marginalized group of workers who have been offered so much less than other generations, right? Like they were born into a world that's on fire, an incredibly unequal society, garbage job market, student debt, no healthcare. Like the world that we have given them is trash, and they're trying to make things a little bit better, a little bit more tolerable. And I think a lot of the young folks organizing today are also making these really important connections between, you know, movements for racial justice and queer liberation and women's liberation. Like I think younger folks are seeing how interconnected all these struggles are and always have been. You know, the labor movement has never been out on a little island by itself. It's one of the few almost universal movements in this country, right? Because almost everyone either has a job, has had a job, or is gonna have a job at some point. And you know, there's this weird, like very creepy tendency I see from like shitty white Substack pundits who like to talk about how like who unions are for, or how like woke progressive issues are ruining unions and all this. And it's like, do you know anybody who has a real job? Do you know anybody who's ever had to deal with racism or misogyny or transphobia at their workplace? Like, do you ever talk to somebody who is disabled, who's just trying to get in the fucking door? Like, all of these movements for liberation have always been interconnected. And it's really heartening to see this younger, hungry generation of workers and organizers really seizing hold of that and kind of carrying that with them as they push forward.
what do you feel is different about the moment we have now versus, earlier moments, in that the sort of exploitative conditions, poor working conditions, these things have persisted. It's always been an uphill struggle to get a fair share or to get a dignified living, for workers in this country. But what do you feel, that there has been a threshold that's been crossed, or a fundamental shift that has led a lot of people to search for uh, a way to struggle and work together with each other through unions or through striking or through any sort of organized activity like this?
I mean, we've seen moments like this throughout history, right? Like whether it's the 1880s,
Mhm.
when we're seeing the culmination of well, not even the culmination, a big flashpoint in the battle for the 8-hour workday, when Lucy Parsons and her husband led that massive May Day strike or march down the middle of Chicago, the first American May Day parade. Shout out to Lucy, my fave. Or when we were seeing all the industrial unrest in the 30s, or then again in the 60s. Even back in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, like people were mad. Like the people who lived through the first Gilded Age were furious and found ways to organize, found ways to fight back. And now that we're living through this second, or probably even third or fourth at this point, Gilded Age, they're still searching for a way to make things better. And one thing about, I think, how connected we are right now, and how much easier it is to see how different folks are living and how they're being treated, I think that has a part of it, right? Like, not to give social media too much credit, but it does allow people to connect with others in a way that folks 100 years ago just didn't have. It's sending a tweet is a little different from sending a letter, and being able to roast your union busting boss in front of hundreds of thousands of people was not something that was afforded to the people who are going to war against Jay Gould.
Mhm.
But and also it's a little easier for workers to connect now, right? We have Discord, we have cell phones, we have the telephone, we have all these technological advances that folks fighting centuries before just didn't have. I mean, I remember during it's in the book, The Great Textile Strike in 1934. There's this the big innovation that the strikers used when they were striking these garment cotton mills in the South. They came up with this idea called the flying squadron, which was basically just driving from mill to mill to spread the news of the strike. But that was such a big deal because what people didn't drive. Like, the automobile is a new thing. And just seeing the way that new technological developments, I think social shifts too, are impacting this current, and when I say generation, I mean all kinds of ages, right? The moment we're living through right now, I think is impacting people in interesting ways. Like the pandemic brought some of us closer together and pushed some of us further apart. There's the idea of the Great Resignation and Striketober, like all of these kind of big, high concepts that are floating around. It really just comes down to like, something's got to give, and people are realizing like, yo, there are some really, really, really rich people hanging out in space and dicking around in cowboy hats, and I can't pay my rent, and ground beef costs like $8 a pound right now. Like, this doesn't seem right. And with the fact that unions are getting a little bit more public attention, thanks to increased media coverage, thanks to a greater amount of unionized journalists in the media who actually get it and care. Like, I feel like you can't, I know I'm rambling, but I think so much comes back to like the fact that there are so many pro-union people in the press now because we've gone through it ourselves. We're kind of helping get these narratives out there in a way that centers workers instead of the boss perspective. Like, there's there's a lot going on basically, but it just seems like this moment, people are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they're realizing like, okay, working together is the only thing that's going to get us out of this mess.
Yeah, no, I think like you said, there's so many moving pieces, where even though, as you write about pretty extensively throughout the book, a lot of these struggles are not new. And as you said here, right, a lot of these struggles are not new. We do have some advantages that allow us to connect with each other and convince each other and work together with one another in ways that are easier than what predecessors had. But I think, one thing I'm also curious about is, in the course of your research, I mean, do you feel that you've also noticed or maybe realize there are new barriers, hurdles that we have to deal with that predecessors didn't have to deal with, new challenges or limits on the ability for us to organize, the ability for us to, try and struggle for, better outcomes here.
Yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, the first thing you have to call out is the government and
Yeah.
anti-worker legislation, the legacy of Reagan, the right to work laws that proliferate across the country. There's so much red tape and bullshit in the way of workers who do want to form a union. And that's something that still needs to be fixed. I don't know who's going to fix it because nobody in charge seems to care, but that's something that is holding people back for sure. And secondly, I think about surveillance, because there were because back in the day, even during that textile strike, the bosses, the mill bosses, the factory bosses, whoever's in charge, they would still surveil their workers. They would send, goons around to peek in their windows and see what they're doing and to make sure they weren't chatting about, any evil socialist things like getting paid better. But the amount of control that employers are able to exert over their workforce now is George Orwell could not have thought this shit up, and I don't want to, Amazon is not the only culprit here, but they are kind of easy to pick on because they keep innovating in the creepiest possible ways. Like you and your coworker, Lauren, have covered this a lot at Motherboard, just what Amazon's getting up to. And it's never good. It's always like Amazon found a way to track. I think you guys had a story today about how Amazon has tracked every single moment of a worker's movements within the factory. That is
they talk to, when they use the bathroom, how much time.
Yeah, that is terrifying. And imagine trying to organize under those conditions when you also have an app on your phone that is an Amazon app that tells you when to come to work, that can probably hear what you're saying. I don't know. It's easy to be paranoid about these things. I know how you feel about technology. I'm on the same page. Just get rid of all of it. But and then the final thing that I think about, which is perhaps less a hindrance to organizing, but is definitely a hindrance to building worker power, is that, back in the day, the cops, they had some rifles, they had some bombs, maybe they had, they had some toys, but the men who fought the Battle of Blair Mountain against the rednecks in West Virginia, they would have never been able to imagine the kind of hardware the cops have now. And the amount of just anti-worker, anti-union, anti-human sentiment that's grown within law enforcement in this country. I mean, I've seen, even just off the top of my head, seeing cops look the other way when company goons are driving trucks into a picket line in Alabama. That's that doesn't help anything. Or just seeing cops have been busting our skulls and breaking our ribs in the picket line since the picket line was invented. But it's just an extra layer of menace and an extra layer of difficulty, especially for marginalized workers, for Black and Brown and Indigenous workers in particular, who are just targeted to an extra degree, whether they're on the picket line or just in a peaceful protest. It's just a little bit more dangerous to try and organize under these conditions and to fight back under these conditions. And that's something that I don't know if everyone in the labor movement likes to recognize that, but it's something I think is important to mention and hopefully do something about. Someone should perhaps do something about that.
Yeah,
what my official line.
What options are there to do about this? Or maybe alternatively, are there stories, from labor history that you return to that give you some sort of optimism or insight into things that people could do about the growing convergence of technological surveillance and control, but also the winnowing away of the legal protections and rights to make it easier for workers to organize?
That's a hard one, right? How do we fix this? That's the $1 million question. And my answer, and I'm not a historian, I'm not an economist. There's much smarter people than me that probably have much more in-depth analysis of all this, but I tend to default to thinking okay, if all these structures that are supposed to protect us, are supposed to add some value to our lives, are not doing that, then we need to operate outside of them. We need to build our own structures and our own support systems and fortify our own blocks and neighborhoods. I don't know what we do about this legislative issue, right? I guess we could vote harder, but we voted pretty hard to get the most pro-union president in history, and I mean, we do have the NLRB is much cooler than it was. Jennifer Abruzzo is like the only good boss, but yeah, like it is hard to ask, like especially when you're coming from a more radical perspective where you don't trust the state to do anything.
Mhm.
It's hard to really think of ways they could help besides just voluntarily abolishing themselves. Same with the police.
Fingers-
Yeah, right. So funny when people ask me these things. I know that there's like more of an established like labor line on this stuff, but then I'm just like this dirtbag anarchist. It's like, well, if we abolish everything, then the workers will finally be in charge. Everything will be better.
Right.
You're not supposed to say that, but that's what I secretly think. Maybe, hopefully, a little bit of that comes through in the book too, right? Because I made sure to spotlight as many radicals as I can, and make it clear that the government has occasionally done some cool things and passed some very useful legislation. I mean, shout out to Francis Perkins, but the government has generally just been a hindrance. It's kind of been in our way. And the only real power that we've built, and I think that we're going to be able to continue to build, has just been through the people. It's been through taking the streets, blocking the mines, taking over the factories, like flexing some muscle. It's more difficult now because of the law enforcement angle and the military angle, and just this simmering kind of cauldron of violence that we're kind of forced to dangle ourselves within. But I don't know, man. I think that's the only thing we can do, right? Is to actually fight back and identify who the enemies really are.
Mhm. Are you optimistic about organizing in this sort of context? I mean, as you said, where it may be a little bit more dangerous, but there seems to be a greater sense of solidarity and empathy with one another. But also at the same time, the question of what needs to be done is up in the air, because it seems like a lot of things are in the hands of people who don't don't agree with us on what to do, right? Or
Such is the unfortunate reality of American life.
right.
The wrong people are in charge, literally always. Nobody should be in charge, but that's the thing, right? But I am, even though I'm spouting doom and gloom over here, I do think this is a really kind of uniquely optimistic and exciting moment. I think there is so much hope to be had and so much just inspiration to be taken from workers that like know that the odds are stacked against us, know that union density has like plummeted even just in my lifetime, know that the laws are garbage, know that politicians are useless, and are doing it anyway. You know, I think maybe that's why we're seeing so many younger folks getting involved, because they haven't had time to get jaded yet, but they've had plenty of time to get mad.
Yeah.
And they don't have, older, well, maybe some do, but maybe some of them, the ones who are the most committed and militant, don't have older folks who have kind of been beaten down and gone through the ringer. Being a labor fan, being a labor person I think it's been kind of a dicey prospect for probably my entire lifetime. Again, I was born a few years after Reagan busted Patco. So a lot of the older folks I talk to, they're excited, but they're a little more like, well, we'll see. Like, hopefully this won't be a same thing as 1977. Like, I think younger folks who don't maybe have as deep of a historical sense of disappointment are willing to take more chances. And also, one thing that's important to realize is like, we're allowed to do this shit. Like, we're allowed to unionize.
Yeah, a lot of people do not do this. Yeah.
It's something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know, because like no one's going to teach them in school. Their boss isn't going to tell them when they show up to work, like, you're allowed to talk about your pay. You're allowed to talk about discrimination. You're allowed to organize a union. That is literally a legal right you have. And maybe finding ways to make sure that more workers know that, I think is going to tip the scales a little bit, because people don't know how powerful they are until they're kind of given the tools to achieve that power.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the resounding themes, where it's like, as soon as people get the chance to organize, either because they're taking advantage of a reform or because they're organizing in the face of a failure to protect them, it's when they're working together that they do realize they have more power than they might have otherwise. I think then, one thing I'm always a little puzzled by is attempts to advocate for a future of labor that is divorced from unions. I see sometimes in these discussions about, the future the future of work, right? And how you can have
Mm.
a workplace where everyone is a family and working in whatever way they want without having some sort of collective unit. I mean, I, I think, or I'm curious if what your take on this stuff is. Like, do you think that this, I know part of it is an enduring and longstanding tradition, like trying to get people to not unionize. Do you feel that, like with the rise of labor reporting and labor organizing recently, there's been a wave or an attempt to be like, no, don't look at unions, or don't look at working together. There are other ways we can get through this.
I feel like there's always been people trying to lure people away from unions because unions are powerful. That's the thing. Like, they are not only powerful, they're effective. And that's also, in a lot of ways, like one of the only legal means. I mean, fuck legality, but like in terms of paper, like getting stuff down on paper, like legal ways to protect yourself at work, especially if you're more marginalized. Like, I think that there's a lot of really valid and important and instrumental ways to organize that are outside of the traditional union structure, whether we're talking about, independent unions or worker centers or efforts like, the Haymarket Pole Collective in Portland, which is just a sex worker-led group, community labor kind of mishmash group led by Black, Brown, and Indigenous sex workers in Portland who've raised a ton of money and distributed funds to like the most vulnerable members of their community as COVID has gone on. Like, I remember interviewing one of those organizers, Kat Hollis, and they told me, in terms of why they decided to do this model instead of a union, they said, well, in a union, it tends to be majority rule, right? Like in terms of voting, whatever, the decisions are made by the majority. All of the workers that I am in community with, and myself included, like, we're always the minority. And we were afraid to put ourselves in a position where we could be made the minority again by joining a bigger union, by being part of this established structure. And that really struck me because they're right. Unions aren't for everyone, but I think the way that like bosses and like tech creeps and people that are coming from that side of things try to present as like, oh, unions aren't for you. Like, we're friends here. We're forward thinking. We're the future of work. We're not robber barons. We're your pals. Like, that is just trickery and bullshit. I think there's a lot of ways to organize that are perfectly reasonable to take if you think a traditional union won't work for you for whatever reason. But I would be wary of people trying to act as though unions don't work anymore, or they're outdated, or they're not an effective structure, because yeah, the numbers ain't great. Union density is in the toilet, but that's not because unions don't work. It's because like politicians have decided to make unions weaker because they're becoming too much of a problem for the politicians. And they're able to push anti-union propaganda and kind of convince entire generations of Americans that unions are just for lazy, fat Tony-esque caricatures instead of for people like them. And that's, we're still working past that. But I think this new generation of labor reporters, yourself included, are showing that like every person who works needs a union or something like it. Every person who works needs to be part of some kind of collective organizing effort, whether it's joining the Teamsters or getting involved with the New York, like independent effort like the New York Taxi Workers Association. Like, we're always stronger together, and however that looks is kind of up to you and your coworkers. But don't fall for the people saying like, oh, you're fine on your own, like you're special, we like you, we got your back, because they don't.
Yeah, I think the point you brought up about how sometimes unions aren't for everyone, or makes sense in every situation, in that like some people may have legitimate concerns versus when these tech companies and their consultants bring it up, kind of remind me of a lot of work that's been done by Vina Dubal, who
I love Vina.
Yeah, Vina is really great. And for people listening, is a law professor at UC Hastings who does a lot of work on like Uber and Lyft drivers and surveys and ethnographies on them, and talks about how some of them have hesitation with unionizing largely because of how bad of an employer Uber and Lyft are. And so the concern is that if they have a union, it's going to be connected to the company and subject them to the worst parts of the job. And that they'll have insufficient power to challenge them or to change it. So they'd get some benefits, but almost certainly all of the worst parts of the job would be preserved or remain in one way or another, which I think I understand and can see why you would get to that. So I think, another question I would have is like, in the course of writing this and working with people, I mean, and researching, are there stories that you came across that surprised you maybe in people's hesitation or concerns about getting involved in organizing? I mean, I think we've talked a bit about some of them where it's like the danger that people may face or the concern that they may lose their job. But are there other sort of concerns that come up with people that might prevent them from getting involved in organizing or getting involved in, challenging managers at a workplace?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So in fairness, most of the people in my book were pretty stoked on organizing, right?
Right.
But but actually, and this was like kind of this is an example that I don't think is even that unique, but it's one of my favorite examples of something that's like, it's a little different, but okay. So in like 1983, the Great Copper Strike, a lot of great strikes in this book. The Great Copper Strike in Arizona, the Clifton Morangi mines. The workers went on strike. They were steel workers, predominantly Mexican and indigenous and Chicano workers. All men were on strike. And the women who were part of the women's auxiliary, they started out as kind of like very traditional, stay at home, weren't really involved in public life kind of women. That was just what the culture was like. And they were hesitant to get involved in supporting the strike very publicly or kind of speaking up at meetings. They weren't sure they were allowed. They weren't sure that was their place. But as the strike went on, those women became very involved. They stopped. I mean, they're still cooking food and taking care of children. They're still doing those duties, but they also started showing up on the picket lines and showing up at meetings, and then eventually started speaking publicly. And eventually a couple of them went on a whole speaking tour of the whole US, talking about what was happening in those mines, what was happening with the strike. And I see some echoes of those women and some of the women that are now holding the line in Alabama with the current, now a year and 2 months, year and 2 months, coal miners have been on the line in Brookwood, Alabama. And again, the women of that auxiliary, when that started, most of them were stay-at-home parents, another kind of conservative, traditional sort of culture. And, the men were kind of in charge, women kind of did all the stuff they were supposed to do. As the strike went on, again, became much more vocal, showed up at the picket line, started speaking publicly, started traveling. And I think that's not so much a fear of getting involved with the union as just more of like an uncertainty as to whether it's your place or whether you're allowed or whether it's appropriate for you to get involved in union because of your personal situation and your connection to the work that's being done. And that's something that I saw throughout the book was like women particularly, and these are two like, conservative white women in Alabama in 2022 and conservative Mexican and indigenous women in Arizona in 1983, they had to deal with so many of the same things. And their partners in the mines are dealing with so many of the same things. But just seeing how women kind of found themselves in a way, found power, kind of got past this idea that certain things weren't for us. Like, oh, you're not supposed to be part of this. You're supposed to be at home. You're not supposed to be speaking up. You're supposed to be a lady. That's something that did stick out to me. Just seeing women just kind of say throughout history, like, well, fuck that. I'm not going to be a lady then. I'm going to get shit done. And I know it was a little sideways to your question, but that's the one that sticks out to me as seeing how people's relationship with unions changed throughout exposure and kind of building a deeper understanding of the whole purpose of them.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the you answered the question that I had in mind. I mean, I think, like you said, I think that's like those two dual examples are really interesting ways to think about the ways in which people can eventually come to feel like I can do this or I can be involved in this.
Yeah, because it's not just, that's one thing about unions and about, organizing your workplace. It's never just like you're the worker, you're part of it, cool. But then you have a family, you probably have a partner, like it radiates throughout communities. And whether you're in New York City or you're in a small coal mining town in Alabama, like you being in a union impacts the people around you positively because you have probably you're safer at work, or you have a little bit more money in your paycheck, or you're a little bit more fired up about standing up for yourself. You know, these organizing collectively kind of means it's a bigger, broader exercise than just focusing on shop by shop, right? Like it's kind of a class-wide effort, and every little bit of progress we make pulls more people in. That's what I see it.
I think, you know, do you think that you would, one thing I'd be curious is, do you think that you would follow up this sort of book with something else on labor history? Are you interested in other areas of labor history that maybe you weren't able to cover here that you could write about, or other areas of the movement?
Yeah, I have a couple different book ideas that I'm kind of batting around. One is kind of labor adjacent, one isn't at all, but one is I haven't decided, but I really want to write more about Alabama. Because I've spent so much time there in the past couple years, and I've learned, and not even just because, you know, I was covering the Bessemer Union Drive from the beginning, and then I've been covering this coal miner strike in Brookwood down the road from the beginning, and gotten to know so many incredible people there, and like gotten to know, just like it's become like a second home in a way. Sweet home Alabama, but I wish that would be my answer saying. But just even throughout the course of researching this book, one thing that kept standing out to me was like workers in Alabama have been going to the mat for a really long time. Like there's some really incredible labor history in that state specifically. And just kind of knowing that, having that in the back of my mind and trying to like show that here and there where I could without making it be like the Alabama book. It stood out to me because whenever I'm writing about Alabama or talking about Alabama or the Deep South in general, there is in some people the reaction is very negative and kind of dismissive in a way that I find very frustrating and, well, infuriating, because some people, especially those who haven't grown up rural and haven't maybe left their little part of the country too much, or don't have any friends who are poor, or uncles who voted for Trump, they tend to write off whole swaths of the country, or whole states, whole cities, just because, oh, well, those people. Labor in Alabama, well, of course they lost. They're always losing. They're always voting against themselves. Like, okay, well, that's not really what's happening. Like, this is like the workers have fought like hell to make things better for themselves and their family. They're just up against these insurmountable odds that they're still trying to chip away against. Like, it drives me nuts, honestly.
I think, yeah, no, it kind of ties back to the exclusionary tendencies you were talking about. That,
yeah.
Out this or that part of the history, even the contributions of workers who have given us advances that we all are comfortable with or familiar with, and also strategies that are necessary and useful to use, right?
Yeah, it's not all like there's no perfect worker, there's no perfect union member, and like the people who've been up against the worst odds and fought the hardest. Like it's because of them that we've gone anywhere in this goddamn country, you know? Like I'm sitting here in South Philly in 1910, Ben Fletcher, a Black man whose parents were enslaved. He organized the interracial dock workers union made up of Irish immigrants and Black folks like 50 years before the Civil Rights Act was even a glimmer in anybody's eye. Like there's no well, they're trying to build a statue to him here actually, but like that dude should get top billing. People like that who, and he got thrown in jail because he was a wobbly and he was a socialist and he was too dangerous and he happened to be doing stuff during the time of the Palmer raids. Like people are complicated and messy, and sometimes they do things that make nice liberals uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. If anything, it means we should be doing a lot more of it.
I think, you know, maybe it was one of the last things. We did get a question from someone. Asking, from Angela McCall, asking, what are your thoughts on policies that impact labor, such as the Federal Reserve's mandate on full employment?
I don't even really know about that. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I think what they're referring to specifically is how the Federal Reserve can use monetary policies to try to that maximize the number of people that are employed in the economy at a level that's supposed to be sustainable, right, without triggering too much inflation.
Oh, wow.
But I think that maybe a better way to think of it is the question that we should always be concerned with is, or I feel like reading and doing your reporting and going through my own reporting maybe is right. Like we're more so concerned with people creating institutions for workers to organize themselves and democratize their workplaces that persist whatever the employment level is, right? And that are more durable than policies by this or that regime. Because I feel like, you know, as you've talked about, as comes up in the book, right? There are regulatory like changes between the administrations can wipe away victories that workers have struggled for over years. And one pressing question, one of the $1 million questions, right, is how do we create something that lasts forever, or not last forever, but you know, like that can persist through policy changes.
I guess that's another advertisement for a strong labor movement, right? Like it doesn't necessarily matter who's president. It's easier when it's a Democrat, but that doesn't mean too much, you know? Like that just goes like, it's interesting. I don't know. I don't follow like policy stuff so much because it just generally makes me mad. So I'm glad that you understand what's going on. But yeah, and also I guess there's the idea of like, if the government's going to just create a whole bunch of jobs, are they going to be good jobs? Are they going to be well paying? Are they going to be safe jobs? Like, are they just going to, I don't know. And thank you for asking that, but I don't know. Well, basically what Ed said.
Yeah, I think it's they're referencing a specific campaign from from the CPD, it seems like.
I got you. I will look at it.
I think that that's a good point you raised, right? Like we could have full employment, jobs guarantee, programs that are pretty interesting, need to also come with ways to ensure that they're either sustainable, or they're well paying, or they're unionized, and all these other things that we also should be struggling for in the workplace, right? As opposed to just relying on the state to hand them down, although they would be nice. Right?
It'd sure be nice if they did something nice for us once in a while. I guess that makes me think a little bit about the discussion around a just transition, right? Like, how do we, especially because I always have coal miners on my mind, but just thinking about, even just talking to some of the boys down there, just about the idea, like, oh, well, if someone came in and said, hey, we'll pay you the same if you just instead you left the mine and you went and worked on some renewable energy stuff instead. Some of the younger ones were like, yeah, sure. Like working in a coal mine is really hard. Like I will absolutely do that if I can still work with my hands and have, you know, that kind of hands-on job. But if you show up and ask folks like, hey, we're going to teach you how to code.
Yeah, get out.
Who does that help? Like this is like, it's hard enough to get some of these dudes to even admit that coal is in a tricky position, let alone showing up with a laptop and be like, come on, let's learn how to do Python. Like I'm friends with some of these guys on Facebook. That shit isn't gonna fly.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, this idea of like the government showing up and actually making itself useful in those ways and creating jobs and creating, you know, an actual safety net. Like I wish they would, but I would not want them to half-ass it and show up with a bunch of like just like shitty jobs. They're like, look, we fixed it. Here, jobs for everyone. You're going to be folding envelopes in an envelope factory forever. There's your job.
This is where the anarchism gets us in trouble, right?
Honestly, I've been left unsupervised too long.
I hear you. I think that's one of the, and I think that's one of the takeaways. I think that, I also hope that someone comes away from your book with, right? Like also the sense that there are a lot of times where the state can come in and provide a massive improvement, but even when they do, oftentimes they're left out. I mean, you talk about field workers, you talk about, you know, sex workers, you talk about incarcerated workers and how the state's actions uniquely harm them or provide a benefit that maybe allowed for more organizing, but also in other moves can, you know, take away those gains, right? Like the New Deal I think, is probably one of the, best examples that you talked about, where it's like, you provide a standard of labor rights, include a huge swath of the population as part of the compromise to make it happen.
Exactly.
So I don't know.
Someone's always getting
I think that,
told.
yeah, I hope that's also one of the takeaways people have from the book. Like, we can do it ourselves. I think also, since we're coming up at the end, like, what are there any other takeaways you would want people who haven't read the book or haven't gotten a chance to read the book to come away with? Or any advice that might work for them if they're thinking of, organizing?
I always come back to sounding like I'm speaking at a union meeting. I love the slogan.
Good, totally good.
But I mean, just the fact that I should curse a little less, that this history belongs to you, right? Like, right. I wrote this, when I first sat down to write this, I thought, I'm going to write something that people could stick in their back pocket on the way to picket line. And then I wrote this behemoth, so it's more of a backpack situation now. But I wanted people to be able to pick it up and read it on their break, on the bus, and their commute. I specifically wrote it in kind of these smaller chunks because I wanted people to feel like they could page through it and take what they needed, even if they're not interested in what garment workers are up to. Like, maybe there's another piece, another chapter that spoke to them. Maybe their grandmother was involved in something. Maybe their cousin works in a warehouse. Like, I wanted to make it as universal is a hard word. I wanted to make it as accessible and approachable to as many people as I could, and hit as many beats as I could. Like, I pulled in, there's a bunch of stuff in this book that you probably would not find in a typical labor history, like the section on the sideshow, which made sense to me, at least. It was really important to me, but is maybe a slightly atypical way of looking at the intersection between disability and labor. But it's totally real. It's a whole thing. You guys will find out. It's like chapter 11. But all I had to say is this is definitely like a little bit of a hodgepodge, but I wanted it to be like, I wanted this to be fun and approachable. I keep saying approachable, but that's how I feel, because I read so many books, a lot of like academic books and monographs, and they were incredibly valuable pieces of repositories of information, and they weren't a lot of fun to read. And it kind of turned me off from learning more about those specific moments or subjects. And that's the last thing I wanted to do with this book. I wanted to make it feel like an adventure to pick it up. And so, yeah, that's the whole thing of it, right? Like, I wrote this for you guys, and I hope you like it.
Well, seems like that's a great place to wrap up for tonight. I've got the book here. I just dropped a link to it in the chat. Much like Kim says, I think he described it as a brick of a book. It does come that way, but we carry lots of labor history books at Firestorm, and they can be great, and some of them can be a slog. And that has not been my experience reading this book. It's broken up into all these different topics between revolutionaries and miners and cleaners and freedom fighters and movers. So it's one that you don't feel pressure to read all at one time, and you can pick up at different times and just sort of like look at the things that are striking your interest or what feel relevant to you. And it is very approachable. It is very readable. And I'm really happy that someone came out with that related to the labor movement, because it's really important lessons. So yeah, there's a link there in the chat if you haven't picked it up yet. I hope that you will. Everyone who registered for this event will get a link to the recording, so you can watch it again in the future. And Kim, Ed, thanks so much for taking the time to hear two reporters, writers who are covering these issues. I think was a very rich discussion, and viewers tonight and in the future will get a lot out of it. So thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah, and we'll see y'all down the line.
Oh yeah.
All right.
Bye. Take care.
Have a good night, y'all. Goodbye now.
Bye.